Johnny Cash saw it while he was walking alone through a town he didn't recognize. It was painted on the side of an old building, faded white letters on weathered brick, the kind of thing you'd pass 100 times without noticing. But Johnny noticed. He always noticed things like that. Words left behind, messages from people who wanted to be remembered. He stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and stared at the wall. The man in black was here. 1958. The letters were old, paint-chipped and worn by decades of sun and rain, but still readable. Still there, still waiting. Johnny felt something cold move through his chest. 1958. He would have been 26 years old then, just starting to make a name for himself. I Walk the Line had been out for 2 years. He was touring constantly, playing anywhere that would have him. Radio stations, high school gymnasiums, county fairs. But he'd never been to this town. He was certain of it. The town was called Millbrook, population maybe 2,000, tucked into the hills of eastern Tennessee. Johnny had taken a wrong turn off the highway an hour ago, trying to find a shortcut to Knoxville. His tour bus had broken down that morning, and he'd borrowed a car from a friend in Nashville, driven most of the day, and gotten lost somewhere around sunset. Now it was nearly dark, the sky that deep purple blue that comes just before full night. The main street was quiet, a few old storefronts, a diner with a closed sign in the window, a hardware store, a barber shop. The kind of town that had seen better days and learned to live with the memory. Johnny walked closer to the wall, reached out and touched the letters. The paint was rough under his fingers. Real, solid. Not a dream or a trick of the light. Someone had written this. Someone had stood here with a brush and paint and written these words. In 1958, 22 years ago. But why? Johnny looked around. The street was empty. A single streetlight flickered at the corner. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something that had already happened. There was a gas station across the street, still open, a dim light in the office window. Johnny walked over, the bell above the door chiming as he entered. An old man sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper by the light of a desk lamp. He looked up slowly, squinting at Johnny over wire-rimmed glasses. "Help you?" His voice was rough, like gravel. "I'm looking for some information," Johnny said, "about something written on a wall across the street." The old man set down his newspaper, studied Johnny for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition maybe, or memory. "You're him, aren't you?" the old man said quietly. "Johnny Cash." Johnny nodded. "Yes, sir." The old man stood up slowly, joints creaking. He was tall, thin, probably in his 70s. He walked to the window and looked out at the building across the street. "That writing's been there a long time," he said. "Since 1958, according to the date." "That's right." The old man turned back to Johnny. "But you weren't here in 1958, were you?" "No, sir, I wasn't." The old man nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he already knew. "Come with me. There's someone you should talk to." They walked together through the quiet streets, the old man moving with the careful slowness of age. He introduced himself as Earl, said he'd owned the gas station for 40 years, said he'd lived in Millbrook his whole life, seen it grow and shrink and settle into what it was now, a place people drove through but didn't stop. They turned down a side street, past small houses with porches and yard lights. Earl stopped in front of a modest white house with blue shutters and a swing on the front porch. "Betty lives here," Earl said. "She's the one who can tell you about that writing, if she's willing." He knocked on the door. After a moment, it opened and an elderly woman appeared. She had white hair pinned back, kind eyes behind thick glasses, a floral house dress. She looked at Earl, then at Johnny, and her hand went to her mouth. "Oh my lord," she whispered. "Evening, Betty," Earl said gently. "This is Johnny Cash." He saw the writing. "I thought maybe you'd want to talk to him." Betty's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak, and stepped aside to let them in. The house was neat and simple. Doilies on the armrests of chairs, photographs on every surface, a china cabinet with delicate plates, the smell of lavender and old wood. Betty gestured for them to sit, then disappeared into the kitchen. She came back with coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she poured. "I'm sorry," she said, sitting down across from Johnny. "It's just seeing you here. After all these years, it feels like—" She trailed off, searching for words. "Like a circle closing," Earl finished for her. Betty nodded. Yes, like that. Johnny leaned forward, his coffee untouched. Ma'am, I don't want to intrude, but I saw that writing on the wall. The man in black was here, 1958. And I know I wasn't here in 1958, so I need to understand. Who wrote it, and why? Betty took a shaky breath, set down her coffee cup, folded her hands in her lap like she was preparing to tell a story she'd kept inside for too long. My son wrote it, she said quietly. His name was Thomas, Tommy. He was 17 years old in 1958. Johnny felt something tighten in his chest. Was, past tense. Tommy loved music, Betty continued, her voice soft with memory. Loved it more than anything. He taught himself guitar, listened to the radio every night. And when your song came out, I Walk the Line, he played it over and over until he wore out the record. Had to buy 3 copies. She stood up and walked to a bookshelf, pulled down a photograph in a wooden frame, handed it to Johnny. The photo showed a teenage boy with dark hair and a shy smile, holding a guitar. He was thin, earnest-looking, wearing a white shirt and dark pants, standing in front of the same building where the writing was. That's Tommy, Betty said. That picture was taken in 1957. He used to play guitar on that corner, hoping someone would listen. Most people just walked by. But Tommy didn't care. He said music wasn't about being heard by everyone. It was about being true to what you felt. Johnny stared at the photograph, saw himself at that age, saw every kid who'd ever picked up a guitar and dreamed of something bigger than the town they were born in. He wanted to be like you, Betty said, sitting back down. Wanted to sing and travel and make records. He'd talk about it all the time. Mama, he'd say, one day I'm going to Nashville. One day I'm going to shake Johnny Cash's hand and tell him thank you for showing me it's possible. She paused, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief she pulled from her sleeve. In 1958, you played a show in Knoxville. Tommy saw a poster for it, big letters saying, Johnny Cash Live. He was so excited. He'd never been to a real concert before. He saved up money from working at the hardware store, bought a ticket, borrowed his daddy's car, was going to drive to Knoxville and see you perform. Johnny felt dread building in his stomach. He knew where this story was going. He'd heard stories like it before. Young people, cars, bad roads, accidents. The night of the concert, Betty continued, her voice breaking. Tommy was so happy. He put on his best clothes, took his guitar, said maybe if he got there early enough, he could play for you before the show. I told him to drive careful. He promised he would. She stopped, closed her eyes. Earl reached over and put his hand on her shoulder. He never made it to Knoxville, Betty whispered. The rain came down hard that night. Roads were slick. Tommy's car went off the road about 20 miles from here, hit a tree. They said he died instantly. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Johnny felt his throat constrict, felt the weight of a grief he hadn't known existed until this moment. The next morning, Betty said, before we knew, before the police came, Tommy's best friend David went to that building. He had a can of white paint from his daddy's store, and he wrote those words. The man in black was here, 1958. Because even though you didn't make it to our town, and even though Tommy didn't make it to your show, David wanted there to be something, some proof that Tommy's dream had meant something, that the music mattered, that the boy who loved your songs had existed and had mattered. Johnny bowed his head, felt tears hot on his face. He didn't try to hide them. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice rough. I'm so sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry I wasn't here. It's not your fault, Betty said firmly. Tommy knew that. We all knew that. Life just happens sometimes. But the music you made, it gave my boy joy. It gave him hope. It gave him something to dream about. And I want you to know that. I want you to know that even though Tommy never met you, you mattered to him. You changed his life. Johnny looked up at her, saw the strength in her eyes, saw the mother who'd carried this loss for 22 years and was still standing. Can I? Johnny had to clear his throat. Can I keep this? Just for tonight? I promise I'll bring it back. He held up the photograph of Tommy. Betty nodded. Yes, take it. Johnny left Betty's house with the photograph in his hand and a heaviness in his heart that felt like it might never lift. Earl walked with him back to the main street, neither of them speaking. When they reached Johnny's car, Earl finally said, "You know, Johnny, there's probably 1,000 stories like Tommy's. Kids who loved your music and never got to tell you. People whose lives you touched without ever knowing. That's what it means to matter. Not the awards or the fame, but the quiet ways you change people when you're not even looking." Johnny nodded, unable to speak. Earl patted his shoulder once, then walked away into the darkness. Johnny sat in his car for a long time, holding Tommy's photograph, looked at the boy's hopeful face, thought about all the Tommies out there, the ones who never made it to the show, never got their chance, never got to live out their dreams. He thought about the randomness of it, how he'd taken a wrong turn today and ended up here, in this town he'd never heard of, standing in front of a message written 22 years ago by a boy who'd been trying to honor a friend. It felt like more than coincidence. It felt like something he was meant to see, meant to understand. The next morning, Johnny drove back to Betty's house and returned the photograph. She invited him in for coffee, and they talked for an hour. She showed him Tommy's guitar, still in its case, strings rusted but intact. Showed him the records Tommy had played until they were scratched and worn. Showed him a notebook where Tommy had written song lyrics, rough and unpolished but sincere. "Do you mind if I borrow this?" Johnny asked, holding the notebook. "What for?" "I'd like to read them. Maybe use one. If that's all right with you." Betty's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she was smiling. Tommy would have loved that. He really would have. 6 months later, Johnny was in a studio in Nashville. He'd been working on a new album, and he wanted to include something different, something that mattered. He opened Tommy's notebook and found a half-finished song. The lyrics were simple but honest, about a boy who wanted to see the world, who dreamed of stages and lights, who believed music could save him. Johnny finished the song, kept Tommy's words as much as possible, just polished the edges, found the right melody. He called it "The Boy Who Never Made It." It was never a hit, never played much on the radio, but the people who heard it, really heard it, said it was one of Johnny's most honest songs. Said there was something raw in it, something real. Johnny never told anyone publicly where the song came from, but he sent a copy to Betty with a note. For Tommy. He made it after all. Years later, when Johnny was much older and his voice had grown rough with age and illness, he'd sometimes think about Millbrook, about the writing on the wall, about Betty and Tommy and the randomness that had led him down that wrong road on that particular night. He'd think about all the people who'd loved his music and never got to tell him, all the dreams that went unfulfilled, all the voices that went silent before they could be heard. And he'd remember Earl's words, "That's what it means to matter. Not the awards or the fame, but the quiet ways you change people when you're not even looking." The writing stayed on that wall in Millbrook for years, faded more and more until it was barely visible. Eventually, the building was torn down and replaced with a small park. The town put up a bench with a plaque that read, "In memory of Thomas James Anderson, 1941 to 1958, a boy who loved music and dreamed of better days. The man in black was here, in his heart, always." Johnny attended the dedication, sat on that bench with Betty, who was 91 by then and frail but still sharp-minded. They didn't talk much, just sat together, listening to the wind in the trees, remembering a boy neither of them had ever really known but both of them carried. Betty died 3 months later, peaceful in her sleep, the way everyone hopes to go. And Johnny, when his own time came years after that, thought about Tommy in his last moments, thought about all the Tommies, all the people whose stories intersected with his in ways he'd never know, all the threads that connected them, invisible but unbreakable. He thought about a wrong turn on a back road in Tennessee, about faded writing on a brick wall, about the moment he'd stopped and read those words and felt something shift in his understanding of what his life had meant. The man in black was here, 1958. Not a claim, not a boast, just a testament, a proof that someone had existed and had mattered and had been remembered by someone who loved him. And in the end, maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to be remembered, to have mattered to someone, to have left some mark that says, "I was here, I existed, I loved something, and something loved me back." Johnny Cash understood that now, understood it in his bones, understood it in a way he hadn't before that night in Millbrook. The music wasn't just about the stages or the records or the fame. It was about the boy holding a guitar on a street corner, dreaming of something bigger. It was about the mother who'd carried that loss for decades. It was about the friend who'd picked up a paintbrush and written words on a wall because love demanded some kind of testimony. It was about being human, about connection, about the invisible threads that bind us all together, across time and distance and even death. That's what Johnny learned in Millbrook. That's what he carried with him. That's what he tried to honor in everything he did afterward. And when people asked him in later years what his greatest achievement was, he didn't talk about the awards or the Hall of Fame inductions or the millions of records sold. He talked about a boy named Tommy, about a wrong turn that led him exactly where he needed to be, about the humbling realization that his life had mattered in ways he'd never know, to people he'd never meet, in moments he'd never witness. He talked about the day he learned that being famous wasn't the point. Being remembered was.